yes, you are talking a good game, but the reality is you don't have the asset. So we had to go and create the asset. And on the back of that, we were very successful at Dundee. And then we looked at Leith and said, we could do something similar here.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders actually are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Stuart Wallace, Chief Executive of Forth Ports Limited, one of the UK's leading ports and logistics groups. He spent over 2 decades in the business, rising from COO and now CEO, bringing a rare, deeply operational perspective to leadership. He takes on the role at a pivotal moment as ports move from being a traditional trade infrastructure to playing a central role in the UK's energy transition and industrial future. Stuart, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you, Belden. It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. So for any of our listeners, I wouldn't imagine there's many, but if there are some who don't spend a lot of time around ports, what exactly does Forth Ports do? And, what does a port operator do itself and what does it enable?
As a port operator, we have physically, geographically located, as you can assume, close to the water, close to the connection points, where global trade has been growing for hundreds and hundreds of years, back to, for example, the Port of Leith, which is one of the oldest trading businesses in Scotland, to the prime location of the River Thames that sits down in the southeast, to the Port of Grangemouth, which in Scotland, while we talk about being on the east coast, is actually right in the middle of the country. The River Forth is pretty much in the middle of the central belt, and therefore Grangemouth sits equidistant between Glasgow and Edinburgh. So what do we do as Forth Ports? Well, we're not just a straight landlord operator. Some port companies around the world own the land and then lease it out. And we're more of a port operator ourselves. So we actually handle the cargo. We put the products over the quayside. We berth the ships. We provide marine services. We provide warehousing for distribution capability. And we're also an enabler of new markets such as offshore wind, as well as more traditional things like paper and packaging and agricultural products. And no doubt as our conversation goes on, we'll get into some of the detail of that, but very, very much an enabler for the trade for the UK. All of our facilities, of which we've got 8 in total, are East Coast facing. So we look to Europe, which is still a huge trading partner for the United Kingdom, and it acts as the connection point for the UK to the rest of the world as well.
And it may be obvious from what you've said so far, but just what's at stake if that doesn't, if the whole system, in particular the ports, don't work well?
I think we've had a couple of examples over the last few years, if it's been COVID or the kind of immediate war that Ukraine and Russia, onto stuff that's happening in the Middle East. Supply chains can get disrupted, and that changes the way in which people receive goods. One of the thoughts I had of coming in today was just thinking about how for people now in e-commerce, it's a click of a button and something gets delivered tomorrow or the day before or this afternoon or within an hour. It's that quick. But what ports do is they enable that trade to take place. We bring things in and out of the country, and therefore when things outside in the macro environment change, then what you can see is changes to supply chains. And particularly when for many years it was becoming much more kind of just in time, then you needed that regularity, you needed that security of supply routes and trade routes operating. People are changing a bit now. We're seeing a bit more strategic stock holdings, both in the UK and elsewhere. We're seeing a bit more of kind of near-shoring, i.e. starting to produce goods a bit closer to home. So India, the Indian subcontinent, Europe, Eastern Europe, and those kind of areas that are closer to the UK. Those supply chains having to become a bit more robust and a bit more secure than what they were perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, before many of these global events occurred and had an impact on supply chain routes.
Can you give us a picture of Forth Ports today? How big is it? What types of ports do you operate?
Yeah.
What kind of industries and customers?
Yeah, I mean, we've got 8 port operations across the whole group. Our biggest single operation is on the River Thames down in the southeast of England. We own the Port of Tilbury down there. It's the largest multi-purpose deep water port closer to that significant population base. 19.5 million people at the moment within an hour and a half for the Port of Tilbury, and that's forecast to grow. It's an import-led operation. It's that consumer demand. So you name it, it will come in a container or in a truck. We handle, as I say, paper, we handle timber, we handle general construction materials. We've got some of the biggest construction players in the market handling cement product, for example, and plywood, things that go into many different products that we require as a consumer. And then in Scotland, we've got 7 ports up on the River Tay. We've got the Port of Dundee. We've got a number of small ports on the Fife Coast. And then on the Forth estuary, we've got the Port of Rosyth, and we've got the Port of Leith here in Edinburgh, where I'm based at our head office. And we've got the Port of Grangemouth, which is Scotland's largest port, and a port that has been intrinsically linked to the development of the petrochemicals industry over Scotland for many decades, and still is a big part of that structure of what Grangemouth does day in, day out in terms of supplying fuels and chemicals to not just the UK, but globally as well.
And the geographic footprint's kind of interesting, if I've got it right. You've got Scotland and then something way down by London. Is that historic? It's been that way forever?
It's not been like that way forever. Forth Ports Authority, as it started in the late 1960s, was put together when the financial performance of some of the ports in Scotland was not particularly great. So the government stepped in to create Forth Ports Authority. And at that time, it was the small Fife ports, it was the Port of Leith, and it was the Port of Grangemouth. And then through the history of government in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Margaret Thatcher eras as Prime Minister, she enacted some legislation that allowed trust ports, and that's what we were. To begin with, we were a government-owned trust port. We opted to float on the stock exchange back in 1992, before my time with the business. And then in 1995, a couple of opportunities came along. One was to buy the Port of Tilbury from the management team. They had previously bought the port from the Port of London Authority. I think Robin Mortimer, who you know from the PLA.
Yes.
So Tilbury used to be owned by the PLA, and as I say, was transferred to the employees and then sold to us in 95, a process that was done, I understand, in 6 weeks from agreeing the principles to raising the cash and doing the transaction. And in the same year, the trustees at the Port of Dundee, which was a separate trust port, also opted to look for a buyer for the Port of Dundee. So we acquired Tilbury and Dundee in the same year. And then from there, it was moving on to a bit of land that became available from the naval base at Rosyth when the MOD was stepping back from their operation there, and we became part of the landowning consortium and then took part of the land ourselves as Forth Port. So, and from that point, it's been organic growth. We've done a few different acquisitions and grown that way, but most of this has been organic growth through investment and making sure that we continue to grow as an organisation.
And you've touched on a couple of things there, trust ports and the Port of London Authority. It seems to me the ownership of ports around the UK is fairly mixed.
Yeah, the ownership model in the UK is quite different than most places in the world. I mean, the ownership model in the UK and Australia and also parts of South America are quite similar in terms of a heavy element of private sector ownership. But we still do have public-owned ports, be they quite large trust ports like the Port of London Authority, like the Port of Aberdeen, like the Port of Dover in the UK. They're all still trust ports. But you've also got some much smaller ports that are still owned by local authorities or local government. But the main operations in the UK, Southampton, Tilbury, London Gateway, DP World, Felixstowe, Liverpool, the Tees, they're all now in private ownership. And that's as a result of the legislation which the Conservative government, as I say, many years ago, looked to privatise many of the port operations in the United Kingdom.
And where in that constellation in terms of size does Forth Ports sort of taken as a whole? Where does it sit?
It's one of the top 3. So we handle about 30 million tonnes of cargo a year. We have just over 1,300 employees now. So in terms of the port operators, Associated British Ports is the largest, followed by Peel Ports, and then followed by Forth Ports.
And you mentioned that I probably should have known this 30 million tons number, but I didn't. What my very rough calculation is, for every human being that's in the UK, you take in a half a ton every year. I mean, obviously, lots of other stuff coming in through other ways, but that's a kind of, for me, a slightly staggering statistic.
Yeah, and you have to look at it in the context of where the ports are physically located. Some goods come in and out of the country by travelling a reasonable distance in the UK, but the majority of stuff that the ports handle, they have a natural geographical hinterland that goes with them. So I talked earlier on about The fact that the Port of Tilbury has 19.5 million people within an hour and a half of the port. Grangemouth is in the middle of Scotland, so we serve Glasgow and Edinburgh. Dundee has a geographical location and some of its commodities, such as agricultural product, that's within a number of miles of that port. So when you look at the UK sector, we all serve a geographical area that sits in and around the port. So Liverpool in the northwest, Tees in the northeast, Tilbury on the southeast, Forth in the east coast of Scotland. So when you look at that statistic, we're probably handling many more tonnes per member of the population within that geographical confines of the immediate hinterland of the port.
And if you had to describe it, what's the purpose of Forth Port?
The purpose of Forth Ports, I would say, is to act as, first and foremost, an economic driver for the areas in which we operate. Trade, as I said earlier, has been going in and out of these port locations for hundreds of years. And that's not by luck. That's by just the way that trade grows. So they're an economic driver. But there also is the bit about we have to look at what's our wider stakeholder group. So I would certainly say the purpose of us as an organisation is to be looking and being very close to our people. They're a key stakeholder for us. A purpose to understand what our customers are looking for. They're a really key, important stakeholder for us. But also the communities in which we operate. You can't work in isolation, recognising that what we do is large scale, it's industrial, but it's done in most locations in the context of you've got other industrial partners or you've got residential towns or properties fairly close to the organisation. And therefore that purpose of working with that stakeholder group, for us, we also do that in the context of our values as an organisation. So our values are that we will always be safe. That's number one in our value statement. We want to be seen as being progressive. How do we move things forward in a positive way? I want our customers and our stakeholders to see us as genuine. What you see is what you get. You get good performance. You get good relationships. We want to be collaborative. We want to do things in partnership with people and understand strategies and challenges and opportunities. But we also need to be seen as being dependable, that people can come to us and we will do what we have promised to do. And I think whether that's in some of the more traditional cargoes that we handle or at the moment on sort of new emerging markets such as offshore wind, where you're now handling huge, vast components that are several thousand tons in weight each, our customers have to know that they can depend on us to do the job well, do it efficiently, do it safely, and work in partnership with them.
You know, much of what you described there, both as sort of your purpose and your values, of course, they all sound great. And many organizations have something similar, but it seems to me often the challenge is, you know, how do you get them off the wall into people's day-to-day activities? So how do you go about making sure that that purpose is, you know, sort of felt on the ground, not just a list of things?
It starts at the top. It starts at the board. The commitment that we've got from our shareholders, who all of them are pension funds. They're in for the long term. They're there to recognise what we do, what we make an impact on, how we grow value for them and the pensioners that they represent. So that tone, that ethos starts there. And then it's the responsibility of myself as the chief exec, through my exec board colleagues, through our senior management team, and further down the organisation to make sure we instill that in people. And it can be a challenge. You have to constantly have the conversation. It's a bit of a cliche, but you have to seem to walk the walk and talk the talk. And therefore, I encourage my management team to be out and about in the business on a regular basis, to be having not always just straight safety or business or economic conversations, but talk to people, get to know them when you can, show an interest in what were they up to at the weekend, how's their family, build a relationship that then sets the tone of the organisation. And that's really important, that for me as the chief exec, then that tone is the ethos of the organisation. And we've been working hard at that for many, many years to set the way that the organisation looks and feels and behaves. I give an example of back in COVID, we instigated a call every Wednesday morning with the senior management team. And whilst we don't do it every week now, we still do it every 2 weeks. And there's now 40 plus people on that call for somewhere between 20 to 45 to 50 minutes just talking about the business, and then encouraging people to take that message and feed it through their teams. Actually, just keeping that engagement, keeping that dialogue, keeping that discussion about the culture going.
You've been at Forth Ports for a while, and you've had a number of different roles. What brought you to Forth Ports? What led you to, to sort of think this is a place I want to be, and what kept you there?
I'm a chartered accountant is my training, is my background, and I had worked for 3 different organisations before joining Forth Ports, the last of which was Motorola and their semiconductors business. And at that point in time, my wife and I had just a relatively young family, and it was time to look at where I was working. Motorola's global, so you were sort of dealing with Asia in one part of the day and America in another part of the day. And my wife had a career of her own, so we had to make some choices, and my choice was to look for a different employer at that point in time. And my predecessor as chief executive, Charles Hammond, had just been made chief exec in 2001, and he created for the first time the Scottish operation. He put all of the ports in Scotland under one management team, and I joined as financial controller for the Scottish operation in the summer of 2002. And so it was a conscious decision to look for something that would interest me closer to where I stayed, and obviously I had young kids and a young family at that point in time. But it was also I was looking for a business that was about people. It was about manufacturing or processing. I had left KPMG and gone to a business that made components for the automotive industry outside Glasgow. Then Motorola was physically making semiconductors. Therefore, Forth Ports interested me. And I have to say, from very early on in joining as an accountant, I very quickly got myself involved in understanding what made the business tick, walking the quayside, going into the engineers' workshops, talking to the commercial teams. And it was only a matter of a few years after joining that I then moved into kind of wider general management, both in Scotland, then down in Tilbury for a bit of time. I was in Tilbury for 2 years running that operation. Coming back to Scotland for the first time, we'd put the ports and our statutory marine function together, so I ran that. And then became Chief Operating Officer in 2016 before becoming Chief Executive in 2024. So in my career, I've had 9 different jobs in Forth Ports, and it's been that variety. It's been that fact that no 2 days are ever the same. But it's about the fact that it's a physical business. You walk out, you see the ships, you see the equipment, you see the people, you see the dedication, you see the skill set and the knowledge that those people have got. That's what has absolutely attracted me and kept me in this business for now 23, nearly 24 years.
A minute or so ago, you used a term that I probably won't have right, but it had something to do with marine services. But I think there was a word before that.
Yeah, statutory harbour authority.
Okay. Tell me what that means.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. So across the UK, going back to this kind of statutory trust versus commercial, there's a really important bit about marine safety, marine navigation, and therefore across the UK, many of the commercial businesses that run our ports also have this statutory responsibility. So as Forth Ports, we are the statutory harbour authority for the Forth estuary and the Tay estuary. So the estuaries that go from Edinburgh all the way up to Stirling on the Forth, and we're the statutory harbour authority for the outer part of the Tay estuary, effectively around Dundee and out to the North Sea. And that means we have to take responsibility for navigation buoys, or making sure that ships can safely travel up and down the river, and that the dredging is done to keep the depth of the water. We work with organisations to provide the pilots who guide and navigate the vessels in and out. And we also own a towage business that we had one in-house, we then did an acquisition and we've grown that. So how do you provide towage assistance to vessels when they're going in and out?
Is that your Forth Ports is a business. Is that statutory authority bit, is that money making? Does it sort of break even, or is it actually, it's just something you have to do and it gives you cost but no revenue?
No, it has to make a bit of money because you're constantly investing in that. So when you're replacing navigation buoys or you're buying new software for your vessel tracking system, and we raise sets of charges that are specifically linked to that statutory harbour authority element, which are distinctly different to the charges that we raise in our port. So there's almost a kind of boundary between the wider estuary and the port activity. So a port of Leith or a port of Grangemouth or a port of Rosyth will raise its own port charges that's to do with the infrastructure at the port, whereas the statutory side of the business raises charges on vessels that transit up and down the river. They pay a levy for doing that. They pay for having the pilot on board to navigate the ship. But you have to make money at that because you have to constantly invest in it.
So if you had to describe, that the type of entity that is, it's not a business whose only kind of focus is making money. You've talked about the statutory authority, the sort of relationships with the community, kind of providing employment. It sounds like it's more than just a we're here to make money business.
I mean, at the end of the day, when you want to continue to invest and grow as an organisation, then it has to make money. I mean, our shareholders need to get their return. The pensioners have to be paid. So we're no different than any other business when it comes to that aspect of being an economic organisation. However, I would say that in the port sector, and I would certainly say inside Forth Ports, that ethos of recognising where you are physically located, how you have an impact on the local communities in which you operate in. I mean, the town of Tilbury did not exist before the Port of Tilbury started to be built 140 plus years ago. I mean, the town grew up from the people that were there to build the port and is still there today. Leith here in Edinburgh used to be an entity in its own right until it grew and Edinburgh grew, and then they became joined many years ago to become part of the wider city of Edinburgh. So I would say that as a port company, as a company that I'm leading, that we do have to recognise the importance of that community involvement, that sense of purpose as to what you are trying to create. I mean, I would take the example, I'm sitting here in Edinburgh at the moment, looking out my window at Leith, which is very different than what it was 25 or 30 years ago. This is now a very vibrant, active community that was started many years ago by Forth Ports when it was selling off land that was no longer required for port operations. So we've engendered that regeneration aspect, and we're still doing it today. We're still looking at bits of land. We're talking about how you fit into a sense of community, and there's bits of the area of land around here that we've retained. We've got grade 1, grade 2 listed structures that we still look after, and those structures are an integral part of how people move about this community. And that has an impact on our people, because our people then get to understand what we're doing for the wider community rather than just making profit. The organisation understands much more of the purpose of what Forth Ports is about.
And what's the strategy? I mean, you talked a bit about organic growth. You've talked a little bit sort of about developing things, but if you had to sum up the strategy, what would you say it is?
I mean, I would say that the strategy continues to evolve. When I took over as chief exec, this business was not broken. Still, for me, it was about an evolution rather than a revolution. And we took time in my first year as chief exec to go back and just reflect on the strategy. And we certainly recognised much more the geographical spread of the business and what were the drivers around the locations. As I said earlier on, Tilbury being an import-led business, whereas Scotland, certainly when the refinery was still operational at Grangemouth, was an export-led, if it was oil and gas products or petrochemicals or it was food and drink. Then it was a very export-led business. And the strategy is to recognise that geographical hinterland. So who are we serving and with what? But there's also an important bit about that strategy of saying, how do you look at the evolving markets? How do you look at the evolving opportunities? So in Scotland, very much about that transition from oil and gas into renewables and what we've now done at Dundee and now at the Port of Leith to serve the renewables market from that deployment point of view. And then at Tilbury, the biggest infrastructure project in the UK for decades, from a road perspective, is the Lower Thames Crossing. And the Port of Tilbury is directly adjacent to where the Lower Thames Crossing tunnel head will be on the north of the river. So recognising how do we use our land, how do we use our assets, how do we use our capability, not just through the construction phase to help that project, but how do we set this business up to succeed based on being so close to that key aspect of an item of infrastructure come the mid-2030s.
And if we were kind of in the room, wherever that set of conversations was going on, who would be there? Was it you and maybe a few other people? Was it a much more inclusive, lots of people got involved process? To what extent did you bring external bodies into the conversation? How did it all
Yeah.
work?
We used external. We used one of the big
Hmm.
four accountancy firms. We used EY to help us on that journey, on that exploration. We did a couple of different things that we had never done before as an organisation. So we went out and we did a customer survey. So we used a third-party organisation accelerator to do that for us. So we gathered insight as to what the customers were looking for. And we also did an employee survey, which we'd never formally done before. And all of that was then combined with the brain power, with the ability to question and tease through a strategy amongst the senior team. And we did it not just with the exec board, but with a wider group of people. So they had to feed into that process.
Hmm.
They had to give their market insight. They had to give their thoughts. And then what that then led to was our two regional businesses, the one in Tilbury and the one in Scotland, going away, thinking about and coming up with not just our normal 5 years worth of financial numbers, but their vision for what did the business look like beyond 5 years. And that then all summed up into a position where we took that to our board last November and talked about this much stronger purpose and vision for the organisation. And ultimately what we come up with was a new and refined vision statement for the business, a vision statement that talks about how you support our partners. We want to deliver industry-leading service and infrastructure. It's about creating a profitable growth. Back to that point about there was an economic driver, but we said we would always do that by operating safely and sustainably, and we'd have our people and our communities at the core of what we do. That was the revised and refreshed strategy for the organisation, which we now openly talk about as a business, and you don't refresh your strategy every year.
You've sort of touched on this topic a couple of times in the conversation so far, but just to kind of look directly at it, you know, increasingly ports are sort of tied in with the energy infrastructure. And maybe at one level they have always importing and exporting fuels and stuff, but particularly around things like offshore wind and hydrogen. So where does that fit into Forth Ports?
More so in the Scottish operation than down
Hmm.
south, but I'll come back and touch on Tilbury and an alternative fuels basis in a moment. But Forth Ports in Scotland has, since its outset, been linked to the oil and gas sector. It was obvious that the basin in the North Sea was being extracted. That flow of barrels of oil or cubes of gas was reducing. So therefore, there was the need to look at what do we do differently. And we started this process 10 years ago now of looking at what the potential market could be in offshore wind. And for the first time ever, we went to the board and asked for money to repurpose some of our infrastructure on the basis of not having a contract, but on a strong understanding of the market potential. And we'd spent time looking at the market, not just in terms of the project, but actually getting under the skin of the project engineers, understanding if we go and build something, what is it you need us to build to make the project happen for you? And the board gave us the backing and said, right, go do something at Dundee. And it was like a light bulb moment for Forth Ports in the market, because up until then, the market looked at us and said, yes, you are talking a good game, but the reality is you don't have the asset. So we had to go
Hmm.
and create the asset. And on the back of that, we were very successful at Dundee. And then we looked at Leith and said, we could do something similar here. The tenant that we'd had in the port for 51 years, who was a pipe coating business, left because there was no activity in the North Sea Basin. So we had 250,000 square metres of space that we said, what do we do with this now? And we're currently doing the Inchcape project out of here at Leith for the foundations, and I'm marking leading example of how to do an end-to-end project for a 1.1, 1.2 gigawatt offshore wind farm. And we'll do the foundations here, and we'll do the wind turbine groups at Dundee from July onwards for a year after that. So a 2.5 year project to deliver the infrastructure that's needed to see that offshore wind field deployed in the North Sea. So that for us is the transition. We still handle oil and gas, we still do oil and gas
Hmm.
projects, but we're also doing renewables. But if I look down south, where the debate about demand and supply. So we've just signed a deal with a company called Geopura, who are a hydrogen producer. They've taken a few acres of land off us at Tilbury, and they're producing hydrogen on site, driven by a guaranteed offtake by the Lower Thames Crossing, who want to deliver green construction. So they're going to run plant and equipment. They are running their whole facility, office, mess blocks and things off hydrogen-powered generators. They're not consuming electricity. They're using clean hydrogen to do this. And that, I think, is an example of how you can use a port estate to then say, how do you facilitate some of this transition to alternative fuels?
One of the interesting things for me, I mean, it's all interesting, but in particular, one of the things I love that's come out of the conversation are the examples you've touched on a number of times where everybody knows there ought to be a demand and there ought to be a supply, but nobody wants to actually put the demand into the market unless they know there's going to be a supply. But equally, you don't want to create the supply unless you know there's a demand. But a for-profit business can say, that's okay. We'll take that first step to create the supply. We'll invest in the asset in the expectation that the demand will arrive.
Yeah, you make a measured judgment based on some hard work and effort to understand the market and then overlay a risk profile on top of that. But what I would say is that as a port company, when you build infrastructure or you do something, we're here for decades. The ports have been here for hundreds of years. Therefore, it's not an in and out and a couple of year type thing. You're building something that can have alternative uses. Yes, sometimes it's quite specialised, but in the main, it's not. And therefore, we can take a slightly different view when you're investing in a bit of infrastructure compared to other businesses perhaps who are a bit more exposed. So I would say it's a measured evaluation of risk and benefit that we go through as a port company, Belden, which is actually quite a nice place to be.
Yeah. If we zoom out a bit, both in sort of space and time, what do you see the role of ports evolving into over the next decade or so?
I know you interviewed Geraint Evans, the chief exec of the UK Major Ports Group, and he used this phrase that ports are how. And I absolutely agree with that. I mean, we're here for a purpose. We've been here for a long time. And I think it doesn't matter which aspect of societal development or government policy that you look at, you cannot get away from the fact that we are an island nation. And therefore, to a degree, the ports are how we get things done in the UK. If that's about growing the economy, if that's about growing our connections with trade globally, if it's about dealing with levelling up and moving wealth around the country, or it's about developing skill set. The port operative for the stevedore of today is a very different person than he or she was 5 or 10 years ago. We are much more into looking at IT and systems, and the skill set that comes with that is very different than what we were a number of years back. So I definitely stand by that position of ports are the how. They will be and should be the hub through which much of the kind of aspirations of government and society wants to see things evolve in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades.
Been a very interesting and for me kind of resonant conversation. I've sort of got two questions left. One is I've certainly heard and I've experienced it a bit myself that there's kind of if you'll pardon the phrase, there's a bit of romance to ports, you know, the call of the sea and just the world kind of going in and going out. Do you feel any of that personally, or for you, it's nice to see that it's a physical business and you see the people and all?
I mean, I've been here since 2002, so something, and if you look at the sector, a lot of people stay for a long time. It gets under your skin. And I still, to this day, love getting out and about, walking the business, whether it's on a quayside, an engineer's workshop, or getting out on a bit of floating plant on the water. It's great to be able to be part of an organisation that has that. And there's this magic about ports. And look, they're not as open as they used to be. Post 9/11 and security codes and things like that coming in, they're much more tighter. But even how we interact with the community, we do bus tours around our ports in most locations once a year to give people the chance to come in and see what happens. And you're right, it sparks that bit of magic. And quite often you'll find one generation back or 2 generations back who have a story to tell, or they know someone who's worked on the docks or worked on the port. And it just has that slight element of magic about it.
Is there anything we haven't touched on? Anything else you'd want listeners to understand about the role that ports play or could play that they might not really appreciate?
I think we need to continue to educate people on just how the ports keep the business ticking. I mean, we make a point of going into schools now and talking to kids. We play logistics games. We talk to guidance teachers. And to say to people, just remember how important the UK port sector is to the country. 95% of everything we handle from a trade point of view goes in and out of the ports of the UK. We absolutely rely on it. And you've got a sector who's keen to continue to invest, who I genuinely think have got the right ownership model to deliver that, and are more than just economic beasts in their own right. That I think you've got organisations who genuinely do recognise the role that they play in looking after their people and looking after the wider supply chains and looking after the communities in which we operate.
I think that's a great note to end on. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Belden. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing how it all goes from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.